And with that epic music, it is time for Lacuna Writer's Room. I am Christopher Gray, author and great game designer. I should say a tabletop role-playing game designer. And with me is Dannie DeLisle. What about you? What do
Hi.
you do?
I am a writer. I'm an actor, and I write mostly games, but I also write fiction, tabletop role playing games and fiction. And I do acting on occasion.
Are you acting right now? Is this the true Dannie DeLisle? Is this the authentic self?
Look, we all have many facets to our personalities.
Great. Well, this is that music you heard was composed by Ryan Franks for Lacuna, and the vocals were done by Nina Story. So be sure to check them out. They do obviously really good work. And
I
this
just
is
feel like I should be on a horse going across the plain where it's really windy and mountains in the background. That's what that makes. That's what that evokes.
that reminds me of the Eurasian steppes, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
where they say Proto-Indo-European language was born.
Mhm.
And because of the vast differences, and they were horse people because you needed horses to cross that huge plateau, and so
Mhm.
they would end up as far as Turkey on one end and as far as what would become China on the other,
Mhm.
and just traverse this entire region. And it is believed that their language is the root of all of the Western languages,
Mm.
everything from German to modern English and everything in between. And
Mhm.
also even some other languages like Indian, which have nothing to
Mhm.
do with the Romance languages.
Mhm.
Fascinating segue. Why am I history dumping about language?
Because that's what we're talking about today. We've done some good stuff. We have our first draft of our design brief. We've got a timeline. We have those things, and those are very good starts. And next, we talked about that we were going to be doing language and discussing other things about that because we want to have kind of a basis for people naming things, so that it kind of has this consistency to it when people are naming things. We're not going to go all Tolkien on it. I mean, as far as I understand, we're not
We
planning to.
could, we
We
could,
could. We
but no,
could.
because we're not
And
going to.
hey, if anyone joins us in the writer's room and they're like, I'm going to take this and make the rest of it, kudos to that, I
Yeah,
guess. So,
yeah. And the reason we're not going all Tolkien is, first of all, we're not linguists. Secondly, um, we're not going to be writing in this language. It's
mhm,
really there so we have a way to have proper nouns that make sense, that are, as you say, consistent and congruent with one another, but also that feel authentic. I mean, one of the things I started getting annoyed about myself when writing in fantasy fiction is that I would just make up words, and that this is the Bolitarian Senate. Yeah, it's like, okay, well, when you do that, first of all, you're going to be drawing from words, so essentially they're
right,
going to be Romance language based words, or Germanic based words, and no matter what I do in a fantasy setting, that's all I have to draw from. So it's all
right.
going to sound kind of blah, but also it's made up, and there's no continuity. There's no so it just feels fake. It doesn't feel authentic.
Mhm.
And when you read Tolkien, I mean, there's nothing about that feels inauthentic. Like these, it's like historic. Like if you've ever read the Silmarillion, it's like reading a history book written in the 30s.
Read it. I have my own
I have.
copy. I even have the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I have the Gateway to Sindarin, which is the book that the guy they got to do the Elvish for the trilogy, the Peter Jackson trilogy. He was the one that did it, and he wrote this book, Gateway to Sindarin. about how he filled in gaps that Tolkien did not, and extrapolating and explains it. And I actually think I told you that if you're
Yeah,
weird,
I need to read it.
how all that works, because he
Sounds
goes into
great.
an explanation of like how languages evolve and how they we use words over time. It reminded me of, did you play that game? What was it called? When we went to the convention together and we created a thieves language. Were you a part of that one?
That was Dialect.
Dialect. Yes.
Excellent game. For all of you listening, if you're into role playing games, great, play Dialect. If you're not into role playing games, great, play Dialect. You don't have to know anything. It doesn't require dice. It's just sharing, and it's conversation between each other, and it is so profound because in that game, the object of the game is to create a dying language.
Mm-hmm.
And so you create a language and you watch it evolve and then you watch it die. And it's really sad. It doesn't matter how the game ends, but it's a profound game. It's up there as one of the best games I've ever played. It's really,
and
really
it's
good.
What it's really good for is getting, like I said, since we're talking about languages and how they evolve and everything, that's a great thing to just see how it is in real time. Almost like not in real time, because languages take hundreds of, but like to kind of play a microcosm, like a smaller version of what happens, and like how we change words,
Right.
to fit, our needs or to fit situations and stuff, and how our perception and connotation and needs create words and create the ways that we use those words and how those words can die out. And it was fascinating to me as an anthropologist who studies cultures, and language is a part of that. Language is a huge part of culture. Like,
Sure.
Y'all don't know. Like,
Well, y'all, there you go. We got rid of the you all word in English.
Y'all.
And so now different cultures have to use different words for that.
Yeah, that's Southern. I love it. It's concise. It expresses it. All y'all, like you just it works.
Yeah.
Look,
all y'all is like you're in trouble. That means you're in trouble.
All y'all are in trouble. All y'all are in trouble. But yeah, I mean, for me, and it's so fascinating because people who really study languages, if you talk, they can tell you where you're from and even where you may have lived in the past, that, you grew up here, but then you moved here and you've lived there a long time just because of your patterns and which words you say when. And it's really fascinating. Like, I remember I was talking to my friend one time. My grandparents are Canadian. We're Canadian. And my dad grew up Canadian. I grew up near the Canadian border. So I heard a lot of that, and I grew up in New England. And then I moved to the South. I moved to Louisiana. And one time I was talking to my friend who was still in New England, and I was telling her about going somewhere. And I said, y'all just don't know how wicked cool that is, hey? And she was like, what? Was that like 3 different things?
Well, it's true. Also when the language evolves, and we're kind of side railing here, but I think it's an important context. It's important context because we're going to have to understand how original Atlantean has evolved into what it's called in different languages, and all the way from Akkadian up to Greek. So I think there is some importance here. But one of the things that you learn about in linguistics is that when a language is mature, consonants start dropping and vowels start shifting. And there was called the Great Vowel Shift. It happened at some point in English, and there was also like the letters C and G were switched, and French kept it going one direction, and English went a different. And so in French you get a soft sound, whereas in English you get a hard sound, and it just goes on. Yeah. It goes all the way back. But even regionally in modern English, you can see it happen. The vowel shift happens when you get lazy with the words, and so it falls into the back of your mouth. And a perfect example of this is when I realized that I had an accent. When I kind of did it on a TikTok recently to see if anybody would notice, but I realized I talk like a Midwesterner. I'm from
Right.
Colorado, and
Oh,
and I learned kind of late in life that Colorado has really a Chicago style accent. It
yeah.
actually, people from Denver sound like they're from Chicago, and that's because of the rails. So you get the
Mm.
Denver Chicago connection, and basically the same accent.
Right.
And it was the frontier for a long time. So that language speaking got a little lazy, and that's why in
Right.
Chicago it is often called Chicago with because I'm
Mhm.
going back and I started noticing it myself when well, let's say the word everybody normal will call it Colorado,
Mhm.
but in Colorado you say Colorado, and
Mhm.
the vowel is shifting into the back, and so I have this kind of like accent
Mhm.
that comes out. Dot
Yeah.
cam, you know, is it a good example? So, but
uh,
that's that vowel shift that's happening, and in
right.
in a couple hundred years, the soft a or the short a sound will be a
Yeah.
long a sound in English.
Do you
Anyway,
know what was the
right.
bane of my existence when I moved to the South? Pecans.
What was it?
Pecans.
Pecan. Oh, it's pecan.
Pecan.
It's pecan.
Pecan. That's what I said. But don't do that in the South. Don't do it in the South. You will have a mob. They will make fun of you and they will give you crap. They don't look. I worked at a restaurant
Pecan.
and we had pecan pie, pecan pie.
Pecan.
And when I started working there, I said pecan pie, and they looked at me funny, and like I dropped off from another planet, and I couldn't figure it out until somebody corrected me or told me that that's not how they say it down here. So, you want to talk about valves shifting depending on where you are. Look,
It's a funny thing to keep in mind, and that's why I think that's why we need to figure out our language, the root language, the core one, that
mhm,
all of the other that the proper nouns were created and then derived. I would like to
right,
know what was there that the Greeks called it Atlantis, because Atlantis is a Greek is a Greek word.
right.
Actually, it's
Yeah,
not. It's an anglicized version of a Greek word.
right, right. Yeah. Well, I
So
think the easiest thing, since our timeline and we're grounding it in reality, I think the easiest thing is going to be to say, what language do we have or would we have had in ancient times that would have been the closest,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And kind of
that would
work
have made
from
sense.
there.
That would have made sense from the cultural flows. Um, interestingly, uh, Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European is not that.
Mhm.
As I said at the top, it came in from the east. It was from the plateau. So the chances that our mid-Atlantic continent was speaking in an Indo-European root would be ridiculous. They
Right.
probably didn't even encounter the Indo-Europeans until they went into the continent, which was long after they would have been around. So I think that we can strike that one out,
Mhm.
which is a shame because I really, really enjoy going into old English root words and Germanic root words and finding new words. I did
Mhm.
that with our game Highcaster. A lot of the
Yes.
words in there that are used for the Highcaster setting are taken from Proto-Indo-European, and so when you hear them, they sound like real words, even though they're not.
Right.
Um, but that's how I don't think that we can use it, sadly. So we're in the Mid-Atlantic, so we should look at the languages that were the language of roots that were around the families,
Mhm.
um, pre and during Bronze Age.
Mhm.
Um, so
Oof.
let's just check it out. I have,
Yeah. It's what a writer's room about, man. It's like,
and while I'm
we
looking
had to
this up, I
figure.
mean, we need to. I think we explain why we need this. I don't think we need to go like you just said Tolkien on this because Tolkien not only had written Sindarin or Sindarin, depending on your dialect,
Right.
but he had written Kenyan, which is the older Elvish
And yeah,
language,
yeah. And plus the
and
Dwarvish language.
And then the Dwarvish language. And then what he did was he anglicized those languages. So there were the actual names and words. And then not only did he use transliterations, but he made up new English words that would have been derived from those other linguistic words.
Right.
So like Bilbo Baggins is not Bilbo Baggins and Bilbo Baggins is language. That's the English version of Bilbo Baggins.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to do any of that.
Right. Yeah. So we're not talking
unless you really want to.
I think we need to have just enough, they have something like Hittite, which is like a Paleo Indo-European language. Russian, English, Irish, and Hindi.
Good old Wikipedia will kind of give us everything we need to know. Since we don't have to be accurate, we just have to be believable.
Right.
So,
right. Look, when you have your goal and you just slap a thing on it, you can do what you want and just say, don't take this as a history lesson.
So we go to history. Let's not look at prehistory because we're looking at, it's way before our time. We're probably zeroing. I think we decided that Atlantis society may have been started around the 6000s.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, what does BP means? I haven't heard that term before. I assume that means BCE, but if anyone knows what BP means. But here we go. BCE. I recognize that. So ancient history is fair. They're saying that the languages really began in North Africa, Phoenicia.
Right.
And Phoenicia is actually probably a good one to hone in on as an example because they were seafaring. They've been all over the Mediterranean and all over the African coast, and they've been up to what would become Britain. So
right.
that's kind of an interesting one to hone in on. When you look at first civilizations, though, it's Egypt and Mesopotamia. And what do all of these things have in common?
Phoenician.
Afro-Asiatic.
Yeah. So
that language root, the Berbers, the Egyptians, Semitic.
Yeah, so we'll be looking. That's what, and I should have said it. Because my first instinct was to say probably Egyptian. Would be one of the roots or whatever. And by the way, BP means before present.
Oh, that's okay. That term makes sense.
Yeah, before present.
So you're just taking out the divide altogether.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think we should look at Afro-Asiatic languages and Phoenician, it would be Egyptian
and Semitic.
And Semitic, yeah.
So and I don't have a lot, a lot of this is, and this was it led to things like Hebrew, which is still living today. But Egyptian and then what would become Arabic. And it might be one language that came up was Akkadian because it's so old. But let's kind of go through. The Berbers were, I don't know a lot about the Berbers and the Kushites. So these, I think, were Central African. I think they were often in conflict with Egypt, if I were mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know for sure. I'm a little fuzzy on the Berbers.
But no, I think
it does say Proto-Libyan, so that means Central Africa or African coast to me. The Shattuck. This shows the region here. There's a map. Not there. Okay, but the Shattuck. Okay, so we're kind of deep into Africa here. The Omotic. Okay, so this is East Africa, and then Semitic, which would have been North Africa, the Levant, and the Mesopotamian reaches, and then Egyptian. So I think that out of all of these, what do you think? I mean, I have a hunch, but I don't want to drive my opinion without hearing your
Well,
thoughts.
I would say, since we're talking about what would come from, how languages come together, we're looking at probably something in North Africa, maybe Egyptian,
Yeah, I'm leaning towards Semitic or
Semitic.
Egyptian.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's because these would have been the first, while there were obviously things going on with the Berbers in Central Africa and Libya, possibly as far back as 10,000 BC. It's the Semitic language speaking people that have our first major civilization. So they would probably be the first to be in contact with our Atlanteans.
Uh-huh. Right.
So if we look at
Yeah, that
Semitic,
makes sense.
this means that, oh man, I mean, so our language isn't going to sound anything like English or any Latin, or Latin or Greek.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the way it is, I mean,
Proto-Semitic was as far back as 4,500 BC, so this would have been the sweet spot.
Yep. Yeah. So, yeah, so we're talking like the earliest would be Akkadian.
Yeah, what are the languages? I wonder if they have them listed here. They're talking about the sounds, which is good. We're going to want to look at that closer. Look how far east this is, though.
That's okay, though. Like, because we were thinking that they kind of spread that way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Semitic languages. So the ancient Semitic languages, and then just scrolling through here, it says all basically the Levant and the Mesopotamia. I mean, I guess that makes sense. If the first civilizations they're going to be speaking to are Egyptian and Mesopotamia, I mean, they'd have to go across the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So it's
But
kind
they're
of
like in the middle of it anyway. So,
well, we put them in the Atlantic, so they would have to go.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they'd have to sail a little bit.
Yeah. I wish it would just show me a list of Semitic languages. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, it kind of does right there.
So,
like the oldest ones were at the top. Old Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian.
Right. I was kind of zooming in on Akkadian before this, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on it. I mean, this is probably a good place to start. It's really old language. It's the right root.
Right.
This was the language of Babylon, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and Assyrian. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have to be careful here, because we don't want to like copy paste this language. We have to remember that this would have been the same family maybe as Akkadian.
Right.
And Akkadian would have been a much modern version of it. Like for the Akkadian, for like the Babylonians on our timeline, Atlantean would have been like to them Old English probably, or maybe Middle English.
Right.
A little incomprehensible, but kind of related when we think about English, because it would have been a very much older version of it.
Yeah.
But it's not a bad tent pole. I mean,
well, yeah, I wasn't expecting we would just like translate stuff into old whatever. But like, if we see how stuff works together in this language, you can kind of back trace it a little bit, or we can change it enough and say, oh, while Babylonian does this, the Atlanteans might have done this instead while they're speaking. You know what I mean? Like, we can come up with the kind of like quirks and rules and stuff that changes it from Babylonian to, Atlantean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
think, and so, but there's going to be commonalities with a lot of the Semitic languages. Okay, so like the consonants, we've got your average consonants, but there's the interesting ones. I think if I just hone in on is the DZ consonant. That's interesting. That might be something that we can bring across. There's the SH sound
mhm,
represented by this like F thing. I think that's what that means.
mhm,
There's the sound, right?
mhm.
So
Just for those who can't see, we're looking at a Wikipedia page,
thank you.
and we're looking at how consonants are in like Babylon Akkadian languages. So we're kind of looking at a chart and seeing what they're telling us. So,
Thank you. Yeah. So it's saying that there's the nasal M and N, which are normal. That's what we have in English. There's
mhm.
a voiceless P, which I don't know what that means. What is a voiceless P? I have a
You
feeling
probably
it's a
talk
sound.
without the larynx vibrating.
So voicelessness is the property of being pronounced without the larynx. So yeah, that's a
P,
f sound. That's more like an F,
yeah, it's
and so
yeah,
th would be like a th sound,
yeah,
and then ts would be like a soft z, and then a voiceless k. What is that? That might be ch.
yeah.
So they're using what we would use as double consonants. They're using as consonants.
Yeah.
Okay, so we could probably just deal their consonants.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, it's a dead language, so it's not
What are
like
they
we're
gonna
gonna
do?
have anybody care.
Yeah, they're not gonna. They're not like gonna give me that back. Give me that emphatic affricate back.
Yeah. But we still want to be, like I said, we're not looking for historical accuracy here. Because I feel like you can get caught up in that. What we
Yeah,
want is, and since we're creating kind of a fictional language anyway, we just want the basis of it. And if we do some different stuff, we'll just say, well, that's Atlantean, not Babylonian. So
right.
that's the difference. You know what I mean?
And
Like
it
it,
should be older. You know, it should feel older.
yeah.
I don't know how you do that, but I think
Right.
it should feel more impressive in some way.
Hmm.
Well, here's a question: do you think our Atlanteans have written language?
I don't see why they wouldn't. I mean, that seems like a given for how we're kind of portraying them, you know? Unless, I mean, the only thing I could think of is unless, when they're immortal, they have such, godlike powers. They don't really need to write stuff down. They just have these memories or, telepathy or whatever. But
The
I don't
earliest
know.
languages, I think, what is the first written language? It might be Akkadian, but the earliest language, like cuneiform.
Cuneiform,
Yeah,
yeah.
the earliest languages were done for civic purposes, so they were, you know,
Right.
tracking plots of land and things like that, and
And
money.
and if our gods are going to be, having any kind of society, especially if they have disagreements, which, they do, they end up in a war and whatever. So obviously they make deals and stuff like that. It would make sense for them to do that in that way. As the same as every other culture kind of developed it out of necessity for keeping track of inventory and shipments and licenses and permits and some of the stuff that we got out of the Library of Alexandria is simply manifest lists.
Yeah,
Like it's not even fiction or love letters or anything. I mean, it's just manifest, and that's why a lot of people didn't read and write, because it wasn't necessary unless you were a civil servant,
right.
unless you
And
were
stories were passed down through oral tradition, and that's how they taught morality.
right. And
That's where the poetry tradition came from, and
right.
theater.
And we have, and people who did learn it, who did use it for other things, were usually used it for short stuff. I mean, we have graffiti in Pompeii.
Yeah,
That's basically the equivalent of, Maximus was here or like so and so has a small penis. Like
Yeah.
honestly, like seriously, you can look it up. I'm not even joking. You can look up the graffiti of Pompeii, and you'll see what the normal citizens of Pompeii were writing on the walls and stuff. You know,
And
and
well, Pompeii's I don't know if it's a fair example because it's pretty late in the literary game.
it's late, but it's well
But
preserved, which is why it's
yeah,
important. It gives us a lot of information that we can then extrapolate back. You know what I'm saying? Like, but you know, my example is humans have been humans for as long as, you know, we've been human. You
right,
know, we're gonna write crap about people on the walls, you know.
right.
You know.
And the Egyptians obviously used pictograms,
Yes.
and they did use it for religious purposes above and beyond civic
Yes.
stuff. But they didn't have a they didn't have a vocabulary in the way that we would consider a written language. Let's look at this comment. So Nathan says the other thing written language is necessary for is plans and designs. Okay, good point. We're talking about having really great architecture in Atlantis. There's, right, you can't build pyramids just by talking it out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, well, that's interesting. Okay, so then I guess it might be kind of a side rail, so I'm not sure how important it is, but it's interesting to think about if they had a written language, what would it be? Was it like cuneiform, where you're just doing a bunch of slashes that ultimately mean sequences of numbers? Or are you doing pictographs or a combination? And the reason it might be important to understand that is because how do vowels work? And are they represented in the written language, or are they just more fill in the consonant blanks? A lot of the older languages don't have vowels.
Right. Yeah. It's just long consonants.
Right.
It's just one of those long things, and you're like, I need to breathe in the middle of this word.
And they did have vowels. They just never wrote them down because the assumption. I might be talking out of my ass here. I can't remember if this is true or not, but the assumption is that if you know how to speak the language, you know what this sounds like.
Well, that's proven true.
Yeah.
We have a lot of innate rules that we follow being native English speakers, right? That we don't articulate and that we don't think about. For instance, the order of which you describe things is prescribed. Okay.
Right.
So we innately know, and I don't know if you've ever read this before, but languages, when you study them, we have a rule in English that when you're describing something, there's a certain order in which those adjectives go and the type. So size, color, object is one. So we in English say large green box. We don't say green large box. And we just know that, right? It's not anything somebody taught you, right? That's not anything you learned when you're learning languages when you're a child and you're learning to speak from your parents and your teachers and you're absorbing your native language. That's just something that we know, right? And another description that we always tack on the end of it would be something like it's a dirty large green box, right? But we don't say it's a large green dirty box, right? It's a dirty large green box. It's just we know that particular rule and how to use it, and anything else, if we do it, sounds off, right? And that's something that actors play with when they're coming up. If they want a specific way that a character speaks that doesn't that seems a little off because it's supposed to be for the character, they start playing with those innate rules of that we know of the language to make it sound different, to make it sound something like normal English, regular English native speakers would not say. People in second languages have all sorts of English tics sometimes when they start learning English because of the way that you do stuff in other languages is not necessarily the same way we do it, you
Right.
know? Like
Right.
we say, like in French, you say le chat noir, you know, the black cat, but we don't say the cat black, right? In English, we say the black cat.
Right. Because
you
we
know?
take most of our language from Germanic, and the
Right,
Romance language take it from Latin. And in Latin, you
right.
do the order with noun and then adjective.
Right. So my point being is that there are all sorts of these innate rules that we know, and that so to answer your question, I really think it's something that people don't think about. It's very much something that I agree with, in that they probably didn't write it down because it's just something people know. Like they know how to speak the language, so they don't need some of the clarifying stuff that others who don't speak the language might need. Um, we have stuff like that with measurements in cooking. You know, you look at old recipes and their measurements are wild because we don't have those things anymore. They'll say, like, you know, a teacup of flour. And you're like, teacups are not standard size. Okay. They're just not.
Or they'll make up some word. Like they'll say, oh, put in a puddle of paprika.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, but people reading it probably kind of knew what they were talking about, you know, and saying, oh yeah, a teacup is about this, you know. Whereas we, you know, now we have the metric system, and us who are weird, the imperial.
We're looking at a chart now that shows Proto-Semitic. I'm sorry, did I cut off your point? I think you're right. Yeah, I think
no. I was pretty much done. Yeah, that was my point. Is that I believe in that theory that it was just stuff people knew.
Yeah,
filling in those blanks, filling in the vowels was just something that they knew.
So we'll know the vowels, but that might not be in their written language. But when we do our transliteration English version of that, but this is a chart that shows Proto-Semitic, and then it shows the corresponding consonants, or maybe even letter, for Akkadian, Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, which are derived from Proto-Semitic, or the root family of Proto-Semitic. And this is interesting because we could probably take and raw Proto-Semitic blind, because B is consistent throughout all of the languages. It's interesting that these are rendered differently. Like I would like to, I'm understanding. I would like to know what the linguistic purpose of putting an underscore under the B and what that means. It might mean P. It might mean P. But anyway, I'm just curious about that. But anyway, that's a consistent.
Where are you when we need you? Where are you when we need you?
We need to get a linguistic person on here.
We need Professor Tolkien to explain to us what these dots and stuff mean.
But we did see that there was a non-vocal B, so it might be actually P.
Yeah.
And then D is straight across the same thing. G straight across the same thing, but it might be a G, it might be a G, it might be GIF or GIF. They didn't. Even the Akkadians didn't know if it was GIF or GIF.
What? If anyone's thinking I'm saying GIF, they ought to just forget it. They'll be waiting a long time.
Akkadians didn't know either.
What?
P is right across. T is right across. T actually goes a little bit sideways though, and it's like I think it might be more like a TH in Hebrew. That's I used to know Hebrew a little. I can't remember what that letter is. K might be K, but it might be. I think we should have a lot of in our language.
Very, very guttural.
Yeah. Or maybe the upper class or the older gods do a very crisp, but then the lower caste goes.
Yeah, like unclassy, uncultured swine.
And so they would say things like, get my language out of the back of your throat.
Yes. No, I love that. I actually love that because honestly, language, I mean, all you have to look at is My Fair Lady. And language, I'm indicator of class, you know?
Totally.
And we used it all the time for racism too, here in the United States at the very least.
Definitely.
The way that AAVE and the vernacular and stuff of African Americans, people who lost their language and don't even remember it, but have kind of had to create their own sort of stuff. And so we often use people's language to oppress them or get impressions of people before. It's the way we are. It's sad, but
Yeah.
I mean, that's a truth. That would be a truth. If you have some Atlanteans who feel like, the elder gods and the immortal ones, are better than their kids who are just these mortals, that's going to happen. I mean,
Yeah.
just look in general how today parents, look at their kids and they're slang. You got a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, does your kid say slang and you're just like, what in the
actually my favorite thing to do is to take slang that I've heard on TikTok and use it with him. I love it. I love it. He loves it. I mean, we really get along with this. He gives me a condescending pat on my back and says, "Okay, Dad."
Yeah. I mean, and don't get me started on languages can also be bonding. I mean, I talked briefly about how language can be used to oppress or for racism or for a whole bunch of other things, but languages also bring us together. When we're speaking the same language, so to speak, and that just doesn't include our language itself, but also professions that we might be in. I mean, you and I are in the same profession pretty much. We can speak to each other using metaphors and using examples and using stuff that we use in the industry that we get, right? That other people might not, So language,
when a fight's about to break out, you say, "Roll for initiative."
Right. Exactly. So language is, I mean, I'm going on, but I'm just going on my anthropology nerd status. So.
I think it just drives to the point as to how important this process is for us. I wonder, what do you think that this is a process, folks should just do in setting and world building in general? Because I got to say, I haven't really, until Highcaster, ever thought about what the language of my fantasy setting was or my science fiction setting.
I think you should. I think you should. I personally think you should. You're looking at where you're borrowing from and what you're trying to convey. I mean, and like I said, language, the way you speak and the way you talk is based upon so many factors that I've tried to point on. Your country of origin, your class, your job, where you're from. I mean, within that country, I mean, it varies so much by a wide variety of different factors. And even an individual, as I was saying, if you have somebody who's well-versed in linguistics and accents, I could talk to them and they'd be able to tell me that I grew up in the Northeast and that I then moved later in life to the South.
Yeah.
Just based off how I say things. I mean, that is how individualistic language can be.
I think if used, I think it can be used to add authenticity to the setting. I mean, we've been talking about Tolkien, obviously, and that's clearly what he did. There's also, what the Dothraki and George R. R. Martin, they actually wrote that language out, the Klingon language, and it was done as a layer of authenticity. But one place recently, I'm going to bring it up again, but Baldur's Gate 3 is really great video game, and in it they have these little language droppings that I don't know. I've run D&D campaigns in Faerun more times than I want to admit. Faerun, for all of you who aren't like me, I was about to say nerdy. There's nothing wrong with that. But those of you who have not played D&D, Faerun is sort of the default setting of the latest Dungeons and Dragons edition.
Right.
And if you saw Prince of Thieves,
Honor Among
Thieves. Prince of Thieves,
that was Faerun.
That was a Freudian lip slip. But if you've seen Honor Among Thieves, that takes place in Faerun. and it's obviously languages and culture and all these other things. It's decades and decades of world building in this one place. Actually created by one guy when he was a teenager. Ed Greenwood came up with the setting when he was a teenager, and then the publisher TSR at the time loved it, and then took it and ran a bunch of stuff through it. And so it's a really deep, very rich setting. You never think about the language. I mean, when you're playing the game, you're like, oh, I speak dwarf, like as if that's a language, or I speak elf.
Right.
But the reality is there's all these languages, and so the game brought some of those languages, and they actually did some language work on it. And I first noticed it when these druids were yelling at somebody, or these tieflings were yelling at some druids. Tieflings are these little like devil people, and they call some, it's you Magrashim, and I was like, what is that word? It's obviously a slur of some sort.
Yeah, obviously.
But it added so much authenticity to it, and then and they dropped all kinds of things like that in there. And anyway, I'm on a tangent, but my point is, having an authentically, I guess, thought through language can really add layers and textures to a fantasy setting or a science fiction setting. That it just makes it feel more real rather than just making up words. We're going to make up words, but we're going to do it now with a structure.
Right. Yeah, because we know kind of what we're basing it on. For sure. I mean, hey, we could take a stab right now since we're in the writer's room. We have the word Atlantis, right?
Yes.
So we're going to start with that to try to figure out what our Atlanteans might have called themselves. Like,
yes, I think coming up with the word Atlantis for Atlanteans would be good. And we'll stop calling it Atlantis.
Yeah.
But
it is for all intents and purposes that that got written about, but as you said, that's not what they call it. It's like in Tolkien, they called it Moria, right? But that's not what the Doors call it. They call it Khazad-dûm, in their own language. A Rivendell is Rivendell, but it's not Rivendell in Elvish. It's in Mladris. It's just because Tolkien's a language nerd.
Yeah, the first place I think we should do is, what does Atlantis mean?
Right.
And then we can come up with our word for that meaning. This is one of my favorite sites. This is the one I was trying to remember last time, and I acted like a fool because I was coming up with all of the words that it wasn't. But etymonline.com, ETYMONLINE, it's this etymology website, and it shows you all of the sources of words. I love it. I'm on the site a lot. I use this site instead of a thesaurus. Anyway, so Atlantis was derived from the word Atlas, because it was a Greek island nation.
Who was sent to hold the world on his shoulders.
Right.
That was his punishment.
And so it was literally means daughter of Atlas. So let's look up Atlas. Atlas is a really new word. Why is it saying that Atlas came out in the 1580s? That's interesting.
Well, it says that the Greek name traditionally is interpreted as the bearer of the heavens.
Okay.
And the copulative prefix. Yeah, it shows you to bear.
Yeah, the PI, you'll see it says the PIE root, to bear. PIE is Proto-Indo-European. So this is Greek is descended from Indo-European. Most modern languages are. And it's saying that is to lift or to hold or to bear. Okay, here's a fun trick. We know about the Pillars of Hercules, right? Which is referring to the Straits of Gibraltar. Right. And it was probably Plato. It was somebody that said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Right.
I better check that out, because that is, if we can make and Atlas meaning holding up the heavens, right?
Right.
We can make a word that means pillars.
Right.
Beyond the pillars.
Well, yeah. Why is, you have to think about, like, well, if he's naming this place, why is he naming it that? Because it's kind of the center of things. It's like holding up the world. It's like Atlantis is supposed to be like super sophisticated or whatever. and they're kind of in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And so it kind of makes sense that somebody in Greek would be like, oh, well, Atlas holds up the world, and this place is kind of like in the center, in the middle. And so it kind of holds up the world, but it's not Atlas, but the daughter of Atlas, Atlantis.
Right.
So, you kind of have to think of that.
We have a whole glossary of Old Akkadian here. Thank you,
Ooh.
Internet. See, we don't have to make up anything. Let's just see. I'm going to search for pillar. It's in here. Let's see if I can zoom this in closer.
See, this is why I think it was Steve Jobs who said you need to hire lazy people to do things, because lazy people will find the shortest, easiest way to
Who
do
needs to
it.
make things up? Have it here. I'm having trouble finding it now. There it is. Okay.
There you go, Nathan.
Okay.
Nathan loves that word, Tiamat.
Pillar.
He likes the goddess.
Dimatum. I have to decide how these things are pronounced. What's interesting when you look at this is Dumtum. Well, they don't know that's actually what it was. Or these are all kind of words that sound the same.
Dimatum, pillar.
I think this might be true in Semitic languages in general, but I do think that having like a root word that when you add prefixes and suffixes to, and then you conjugate, will change all of those words with the meaning of the word. So if the root word is dimatum, it might be pillar. So that maybe it might be that. So
what you want to do is
like dim is the root word, and then atum might be a suffix.
Right. Well, dimatum looks like that is the base. So what you would want to do is it would be more something like look up ocean. See if they have like
I see where you're going with this. Yeah. All right. Well, let's see C if they have C. Aha. That's no. I don't want the word research or seal. I wonder if you can do this. All right. Waters.
Yeah.
Water skin is not doom. This is there's an apostrophe here. The Semitic languages used apostrophes, and they were often glottal stops. And if you're unfamiliar with a glottal stop, that would be how the people in Liverpool say Beatles. Beatles. The T is a glottal stop.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of having glottal stops in our language. But it was very common in Semitic languages, and it is in Hebrew. Aleph in Hebrew is a glottal stop. And what's interesting is that Aleph is often used. Aleph is not just in Hebrew; it's in other Semitic languages. It's often used as the first letter. So it kind of it's like the sound before the sound, and it makes a language sound. I don't know. It makes the language sound cool. Maybe it makes the language sound old. I'm not having any luck finding the Akkadian word for ocean, but you know what? They were in the middle of the desert, so.
Right. But, saying something like what I was going to say is you can just take that,
It's not telling me.
Into Hebrew. Or water or something like that. But I was saying like water, like pillar of water, like in the middle of the ocean, like a smaller. Is Tiamat? Is it?
I'm trying to find the transliteration. I mean, it's telling me what it is in Hebrew, which is great, but I can't read Hebrew. What was in Egyptian? I think it might be.
How to say ocean?
Yama.
Yama. Nathan's saying that it might be Tiamat. Might be ocean.
Oh, okay. I'm glad Nathan brought this up. Because one of the things I want to do at Tiamat, I just want to do this because I think the story of Marduk destroying Tiamat is very clear that he separates Tiamat.
Mm-hmm.
And that always struck me as a great metaphor that actually these were it was a nation that he separated into two, or
Right.
peoples. So I love the idea of taking Tiamat. Let's just see what. Yeah, we know. I don't want to go to study.com. Don't go to study.com for this stuff. Go to Wikipedia. Okay. The primordial sea. That's what I think it was noon in Egyptian, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's a primordial sea mating with Abzul, the groundwater, to produce gods in Babylonian epic. Etymology, there you go.
So
Pimatu following.
Yeah, Tom2 was the early form. So when we go back to our Arcadian pillar, Dimatum,
Yeah.
and then Tom2. And also we have to make it sound cool. Like, I don't think like Dimatum Tomtum sounds cool. So we might need to.
Well, no, often if you're going to do words, since that's the base of the word, like that's just the the root of the word, it would be use like the different parts of the word, right? It would be like
I'm gonna go to our scratch pad.
Yeah, if you have something like the two options, so you would have to write them down. You have Dimatum. And then what was the other one?
I have to look it up as I'm gonna pull up our scratch pad. I'll put it there. So I'm sharing our scratch pad, and let me go back to the Wikipedia article. Well, it said the word for sea in Akkadian was Tomtu. It's an A with like a little triangle on top, or like a little mark on top.
Circumflex, they call it in French. The little hat.
Oh, what does it sound like in French?
I'm trying to think of a word that has it. With hospital would be hospital.
Okay.
Or
yeah,
it's kind of the circumflex. Yeah.
So Dimatum is trying to. It really wants to fix my spelling. Dimatum.
Well,
do not. No, I want to spell it like that. I swear. Dimatum means pillar, and Tomtum means siller. See, they sound similar.
Didn't it have two? For
there was
pillar?
Dimtum.
Dimtum and Dimatum. Was that the two?
Yeah. Right.
So, in my estimation, okay, in my experience, like I said, we're just trying to make this sound real here. Like the TUM is part of like the base of the word that you wouldn't, like if you're going to put them together, you would, you wouldn't put like the tum on it. It would get cut off. It would be something like, when you're making vowels, or you're making verbs, and the root of the verb is something else, like, mange, is eating in French, is to mange, to eat, but then you change it based off what verb you're using, past, present, present. But putting words together in this sense, you would take the words and put them together. Look at the example of bicycle, right? Bicycle, bi and cycle are not the roots of those words, but you took the two words and put them together. So
and I think, you know, I found the words for land and city that we can work with too, because they might have derivatives based on, are we talking about the whole continent of Atlantis? Are we talking about the city of Atlantis? Are we talking about the people of Atlantis? They might have 3 different words that are all on the same root.
Right.
So I don't know. I have to like. Also, it might be fun to remember Atlas Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Atlas was called that in the Greek because actually an old Atlantis word.
Right. Okay.
So let's not chuck that out entirely. And you know, when we think about as consumers of this story and of this setting, it might be worthwhile trying to bring Atlantis in some way so that it feels and sounds familiar.
Uh-huh. So, yeah.
Remember,
so,
A can be an aleph, you know, if we wanted to make it one.
Right.
It doesn't have to be Atlantis.
Right.
It often is. If you see an A at the beginning of the word in a Semitic language, it's probably aleph. Well, here's our problem. This is all of the data. What do we do with it?
Right. Okay. So, yeah, like I said, so what you would want to do is you would take the two words to go together and you would kind of put them together. So, like if you have like I'm right now it's silent because I'm just looking at what you've written here.
So like, okay, we could just start putting them together. So like tum is the same across both of them. So
yeah.
Tom Dim. I don't know. Doesn't ring.
Tom Dim. Dima Town. Dimakar. Urutam.
Hold on. Let's just go back. So if it's what if it's Atlam?
Atlam.
And the city is Atlamkur. Oh, that's land. Atlamru. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I see where you're
not
going.
Bad. It's not bad. And I'm taking, or it could be at lim with an I. Would accomplish the same thing because it's taking Ema and because T and D might be the same letter.
Right.
And and Im might be the same root.
Mm-hmm.
So they could be the same word depending on how they're pronounced.
You could do something like
or
Urudim.
What was that?
Urudim. Pillar City.
Urudim. Ooh.
Urudim.
I kind of like that.
Pillar City.
And Kurdim.
Yeah.
Ooh, there's some good stuff here. How do we pick?
Right. I mean, and these
I
are
have a
just the
personal
words
favorite
we
already.
picked out. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like if we wanted to think about it a little bit more, we could sit there and figure out like, well, what would the Atlanteans like want to call? You know what I mean? Like what would they think of themselves as? Would they call it like Pillar City or City of Heaven, or like, what would they be thinking about like the place that they live?
Well, I mean, it could be that we'd have to get into some of their. It could be that the architecture of this home city where the divine live is pretty extraordinary, and so they might just call it City of Pillars, right?
Yeah.
And then that became kind of the name of the land. But that it would mean that the city might have a newer name than the region or the people,
Uh-huh.
and the region and the people might have an older name that isn't about the pillars, if they named it after how awesome the architecture is, or if they named it because we are the people holding the world up, and that's how they view themselves, then pillars would mean that more in the Atlas Greek kind of way,
Right.
and that would probably be the name they would use throughout. It could go either way.
Yeah. It could. It could. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting stuff. Certainly, to think about. I mean, I think of these, Udim is kind of cool. Personally, I think that sounds cool. Um, but I might also like want to look through that glossary you found and see if there might be something that strikes in there, as a word, proposition, something, um and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, in other words, this is how words get kind of like made. You're kind of taking the two things and kind of putting them together. I mean, my name, like DeLisle, is French. It means of the island, but the way it's spelled and the way it's said here is very different than they do in French. So, um, it, I mean, doing this sort of thing, I think is how it would happen. They'd have the roots of their words, and then they would just kind of try to put them together, in an aesthetically pleasing way,
Yeah.
because that's how we do with languages. If somebody comes up with like a phrase, right, and it doesn't sound right, or they're nouning verbs, and it doesn't sound quite right, we kind of know it, so we do things that kind of sound good together.
Right.
That's why we say asshole and not whole ass, because it just, you could, but it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound, it has very different meanings. So it sounds
Well,
so,
there's a whole ass pizza, and that asshole ate it. That asshole ate a whole ass pizza.
yeah, so
Uh, we
different
have.
connotations.
I also saw the way that Akkadian anyway deals with. Um, well, it was pronouns a whole other thing, but plural and singular. The plural would add a u on the end if it's nominative. So, but if it's oblique, it would add an I. So it could be, you know, the Urodimi would be the people, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Dimmy. Yeah.
or if I am from Atlantis, and I might say Uridim, or that word I have trouble with already.
Yeah. What you're
Uridimu,
gonna want to look
yeah.
for is, if you're trying to make words, you want to look up how compound words work.
I think my
And
favorite
now
is on this list is Atlam,
Atlam.
or Adlam. but it could then, the plural, then the people would be Atlemi. But I'm not sold on it yet. I mean, I think we can do some thinking on it.
Yeah,
We're
I
just going to
think
have to
that,
make an executive decision and say this is what it is,
right,
and then start constructing the language based on this, and so we can have a list of nouns that we pull from.
And I always find when naming stuff, if you you hit the right name and you're like, yeah, that's it. So I think we have like a good place to start on this. And then, next time we can maybe, have some other suggestions and come to a conclusion. And then we can start looking at, other stuff that we wanted to talk about,
Yeah, we have to get to the nitty-gritty of what magic looks like, what technology looks like. We had to figure out what the cataclysm was,
right?
How immortality works. We had to figure out some of that stuff, and so I think that this is going to be a thought process probably between you and me, and we're just going to have to come to accords.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how much we could bring our audience through this process beyond what we've done. We're just going to have to decide. And then we can come up with a language. Yeah. We could take make a language architecture and present that. So why don't we do that? And then our next session will then be about some of those world details we need to figure out still.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. Yeah. I mean, because here we are when you've kind of explained to people how we're thinking of it. And then, when we come to a decision, we can just explain how we came to that decision. We took these things together and it sounded super cool and super like something, people would say, because we do as people, like I said, people are like, well, does it make any sense and stuff? Even if the word doesn't. Here's what I'm trying to say. Let me back up a little bit. When people are creating languages or they're trying to translate stuff, it sometimes, if you're not familiar with that language, you can sometimes get very caught up in the rules and not so much the music and flow of language, which there is.
Yes. And I'm way more interested in the music and flow of the way they sound than I am in the meaning.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we do that all the time. You know what I mean? Like rapping and when we choose words and the way they sound, And so it's not unheard of in language just to go, I don't like that name. I don't like this name. Even though they mean what I want it to mean, they're not quite right. But then I got this thing over here that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how people name their kids sometimes. Like I saw a video of this guy trying out different names by yelling it across the house to see how he felt yelling that kid's name across the house. And he'd shout it and he'd be like, Lila, oh, I like that. Like that. Herbert, no, and it's just trying it out. That's how we do it. We are patterned. We are aesthetic beings. We are. And it's no reason to think that the Atlanteans wouldn't be aesthetic with it as well. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it needs to sound good in the fiction. And the setting is going to be, hopefully everywhere. And it needs to have the same eloquence as, some of our beloved settings and their names.
Right.
I think Faerun is a terrible name for a setting. So that's a bad example. Sorry, Mr. Greenwood.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that's just the way it is. So, if anybody's going to come and say like, well, these two words wouldn't actually be put together like that, or whatever. It's like we have words that are put together all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different reasons, including English. Some of it has to do with the root word. Some have, whether it is, Greek-based word, Germanic-based word, Romance language-based word, because English uses them all.
Right.
Like I said, we follow other languages down dark alleys and root through its pockets for stray grammar, So, yeah, so that is a consideration, because you got to think about, at some point, somebody was naming Atlantis. Like,
Yes.
somebody was naming it. And they don't just do it by like throwing this and throwing that together. They'll try that way, but then they'll do what we're doing. Oh, how does that sound?
Yeah.
How does that sound together? My name, Danielle, full name, means God is my judge, because it has an IEL on the end, which is God, and then judgment and stuff on the end. My name is slapped together like one word, but it means God is my judge. God, IEL at the end. That's where we get Gabriel,
right?
All of that, the angel names.
And El and Elohim. God. Yeah, right.
And so you put it together, but my dad picked out my name because it sounded good with DeLisle, Danielle, DeLisle. So even my dad, and my middle name's Lynn. So, Danielle, Lynn, DeLisle, you got all the L's and the D's and stuff. So even humans today pick out names based on that. Like, how does it sound? How do I like the sound of it? And putting it together.
I think one challenge I'd like to meet, I agree with everything you said, but I would like to add one challenge to this, which is that you can see where Plato got the word.
Okay.
It's an ancient word, not the same word, reminiscent. And you're like, oh, well, that's the Greek version of the Atlantean word. That makes sense. I would like that. If we can hit that note, I will be very happy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's think about it. I think that's our homework. I don't think we need to bring the audience through the ecstasy.
Yeah.
The agony.
The ecstasy and agony of naming things, which is like the bane of every writer. What the hell am I going to call this thing? I don't know. And then you have to like copy paste or replace all in your document because you changed somebody's name like 50 million times. And you're like, oh, that's when they were named Humphrey. They're not Humphrey anymore. And you get somebody reading it going, who the hell is Humphrey? Oh, that was like 5 drafts ago. Sorry.
Clearly Gaston.
Clearly Gaston. He was clearly a Gaston. I was misinformed. My apologies for that. So, that's just how it works. That's how the creative thing works. Yeah. I mean, my thought is like, because he was basing the word, like it's daughter of Atlas.
Daughter of Atlas. Yeah.
Daughter of Atlas. So
daughter of the person that holds up the heavens.
That's more based on
Daughter of the pillars that held up the heavens.
Yeah. So you'd have to find kind of, if you want it to kind of sound the same, your kind of way for getting there would be Plato saying, hearing the word from an Atlantean or seeing the Atlantean word, right? And going, oh, Atlas, of course, that makes sense because he's looking at the way it sounds, right? But of course, you can also take the tack of, he's just naming it off what he like the concept of the place rather than anything else. That the word doesn't sound that way, but he's naming it off the concept.
I think it just needs to be, or ideally, the challenge is that this is the Greek word for it.
Right.
And you can kind of see how that happened.
Right. Yeah. No, totally cool.
Yeah.
So, but what I'm trying to point out is there's multiple ways to get there.
Yeah, totally.
Totally. There's multiple ways to get there. You can take different avenues because etymology happens differently in language, some of it out of necessity, some of it out of aesthetics, some of it, out of wanting to separate people, like, oh, that's what these people call it. We're not going to call it that because, they're beneath us. You know what I mean?
These are not French fries. These are crisps.
Yeah, these are, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Chips. I mean, like I had a roommate who's
it's chips.
It's chips. But I had a friend who was from Australia, and she would tell me, she's like, oh, she says, your boot's open. I was like, what? Your boot's open. What the? You got to close the boot. The what? What in the hell are you talking about? She's talking about the trunk of my car.
Right.
Language is a funny and beautiful thing.
Get that jumper out of that boot.
Yeah, get the jumper out of that boot. Like, what? Why do you call it that? You just picture people in England just jumping around with these things on, and that's why they call it a jumper, right? There's just a bunch of English people just jumping, just with their sweaters on. Why in the hell do you call it that? I'm sure there's some historical reason, but like I said, people call the same thing different things for all sorts of reason. All sorts of reason. We call them sweaters. Why do we call them that? We're cold when we put them on. We're not sweating. Why do we do that? Look into it. Why do they call them jumpers instead of this? That's what we're playing with when we're trying to name Atlantis.
Right.
Why did they Atlanteans themselves call it this? Why did the Greek call it that? What's the connection? There's got to be. It's the same thing. We're looking at the same thing, but they're connecting it to different things and call it something else. Maybe it does sound the same. You know what I mean? That's where you get romantic languages kind of are similar. If you lose one, you learn one, you're pretty close to learning the other romantic languages.
Right. Just going to pronounce everything wrong.
I'm like nerding out on language.
Yeah, I could go on.
I've been going on.
I think I think we can wrap, but I do want to talk about because it's come up a couple times about what we're going to be doing with the setting to allow folks to participate in the setting. And I'm going to say very bluntly, we don't have a process yet. We're not ready, but I believe the path that we're going to take is that the setting itself would be open up to the Creative Commons using, in the game world, we call it a systems reference document, but it'll be like a Bible document that you would use. And as long as you're compliant with that document, then you can use the setting. And then, however, I think there's going to be another layer where, if the story is to be canon within the setting, then there'll be a separate process in which you would work directly with the Lacuna team and do the world building and story building together. And then, that would be a more formal relationship. That's how I think this is probably going to go, but we don't have enough built out to even create a process yet. I think we will soon, once we get past some of these definitions and we figure out what the setting is pretty clearly, and we can write that document. And, I think we can probably put some formality there. But I just wanted to let everybody know what we're thinking on that front.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Cool. Well, if there's nothing to add,
I think we just displayed for an hour and a half how big of nerds we are.
I am a competent academic. I reject the notion.
We are being intellectual and discussing an important cultural artifact. But basically.
Okay, we're nerding out. I do nerd out over history and language. Yeah. I think I brought up the podcast before, but check out the history of the English language. It's an excellent podcast, and it's a really good introduction into linguistics too. But it shows it does history, but through language. Really, really good stuff. I'll put it in our show notes for that.
Yeah, definitely do. I'm excited. I'm going to go over this kind of glossary and maybe come up with some options, and then we can kind of discuss it next time, and then move on to some other definitions that we think need to happen before. Nothing too fancy. I mean, if people have noticed and watched through these, we're not being too specific for a reason. We just want to build the edges of the playground is what we're trying to do. We're trying to build the walls and the floor, and then, that's sturdy enough that people can come in and play in. That's our goal. So,
well, this has been Chris and Danny in the Lacuna Writers Room. Thank you for joining us. So we're streaming every Sunday at 3 p.m. We're keeping that up so far. So that's 3 p.m. Pacific. So we'll continue to try to keep that up. There's a conference coming up, by the way, in LA that I'm going to, and I'm not 100% sure. I was going to see if we could get something at the conference going, for a stream, but I might not be able to put that together, and it's possible we might skip a week, but we'll find out when we get there. That's in a couple weeks. So tune in. We are on YouTube and Twitch, both places at Lacuna World. I've also been distributing this onto the podcast, into the podcast universe. So you can find that podcast on any of the podcasters that you use. And that's also linked over on the website, Lacuna World. So that's about it. Be sure to jump into our Discord. I'd like to get that hopping. I'm going to start putting all of these resources in there. I haven't yet, but I'm going to. So if you want to see some of the notes we're taking and participate and throw in your own 2 cents on what we're working on, join us in Discord. You can find the link at our website.
Yes.
I think that's it.
That's it.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.